All right, well, great to be here. Thanks for the introduction. Ray, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Ben. I am looking forward to rapping with you here. I've been following your content for a while myself, so excited about it.
Yeah, great to hear. So we have a great topic, one that's near and dear to my heart today, and that's about setting up your revenue operations process and how to plan for your targets for next year or even this year. So we're going to have a lot of information in this session, and I'm going to frame up the discussion here a little bit, because there are a lot of motions with sales, inbound, outbound. We're going to talk a little bit about the outbound motion, saying, the founder, the CEO came to us and said, hey, you've got to achieve 5 million of bookings next year, 5 million of net new ARR. And we're going to frame it up that way and think about it in terms of, all right, we have deal sizes from 25 to 75K. We've got an outbound motion. And now in sales and finance, we're tasked with this goal to hit next year. How do we go about planning this process? How do we plan out our revenue and how do we target this so we can be successful either this year or next year? And things that I immediately think about as a CFO when I'm going through my sales planning process and budgeting process, with the target next year is looking at, well, how have we trended in the past? What is our current performance? I'm thinking about staffing. I'm thinking about quota, thinking about, hey, how big is our pipeline and our win rates? And of course, our lead flow. So a lot of things come to mind here, but usually the CFO doesn't really have the heavy lift. They're very involved in the planning. And then I work with my sales leaders. So want to pass it over to Ray here. When you've been tasked with this, this target of 5 million for next year, what are the things, top of mind that come to, and then we'll kind of dive into the details of each.
Sure. And I'm sure a lot of the audience too, they may not be at 5 million yet, and maybe their number is 600,000 this initial year, whatever it is. But, we'll do our best to kind of incorporate everybody into the mix. But if we start with something like 5 million, all right. And so first off is just tiny bit of background on me on top of what Hari had said is I've done the 0 to 10 million ARR, a couple things now. I was very early at Marketo. And so I've been able to pick up some learnings and mistakes that we can ultimately apply to this equation. So when I think about, all right, let's say CEO tells us, what's the plan to get to 5 million ARR? The first question I'm asking a little bit is, what's the blueprint? So, you've got different types of new business ARR. You've got true net new logo. You've got new expansion. You might even have some kind of cross-sell if you have multiple products. Most of this group is just going to be net new logo, but ultimately you're going to think of that 5 million as like a pizza pie. What percentage of that 5 million is going to go into each of those buckets? But let's assume for most early stage startups that a lot of the revenue, especially early, is going to be just net new business. But I'm guiding as you want to think about that in a pizza pie first. So, once you figure out, hey, a lot of it's going to come from net new business, you and I think are going to look at some of the same metrics, Ben, things like what's the average sales price? How long does it take to close a deal? And then ultimately build an Excel sheet that spits out what do we need from a capacity perspective? What do we need from a pipeline perspective to ultimately go and execute to doing that?
Yep, absolutely. And typically, if we dive into like, hey, how do we allocate that pie, whether it's 600K or 5 million? I think of bookings in these terms, right? New business, so new customers or new logos. And then we have our existing customer base or expanding our existing customer base, through upsell, cross-sell, but like you said, Ray, if we're a startup, we're early stage, probably that target that we're setting is going to be primarily, new business that we're going after.
Yeah.
So we look at that, so we look at, all right, the 5 million or the 1 million, is it going to be new logos, expansion business, who's going after that? Then I also, as a CFO, my reality check is, well, where has our historical performance been? If we're shooting for 5 million, what did we close this year or last year? Was it 500,000? We've got a huge gap. Is it realistic? And then what resources are we going to need to actually achieve that? So what do we think is next, in the process? So we said, hey, 5 million, it's going to come from new logos. And then where do we step into next to plan this out, Ray?
Well, so here's something to think about is, obviously the finance person in you is thinking about what are the historicals. But a lot of startups and a lot of early stage revenue leaders have to build a plan without historicals, right? And so ultimately, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay, what are quotas going to be for the sales capacity that you have. And so the rule of thumb that, I've heard many great leaders pass on to me that I'll share with everybody here is ultimately you want to find something you can scale between 4 to 6x on target earnings for your sales capacity. So ultimately, let me tell you what that means for those who might not be as familiar. So the concept of on target earnings for a sales rep is if they hit their quota, what should they make? And so in a lot of sales roles here in the United States, maybe you've got a relatively mid-market sale, your on-target earnings might be $190,000 a year, 50% of which is base salary, 50% of which might be incentive-based compensation. And so once that rep is fully ramped, and we'll talk about ramping in a few minutes, you usually want to set quotas which are 4 to 6x OTE. Now, earlier on in a business, what you're looking for here is you just want to find something you can scale, and you want to create a culture of winning. You want to build a fair plan. So let's say that you're hiring people with an OTE of 200K. Well, one mental exercise would be, well, what if we made quotas 800K fully ramped? That's 4x OTE. And so maybe it ends up being a little bit lower than that. Maybe it ends up being higher than that. It doesn't really matter this early, but you're just trying to find something that you can ultimately scale. And then when I think about scale, I think about this line, which is build a plan and set quotas so that 60% of the team can hit their quota and the other 40% know that it's them if they're not hitting quota. Because the worst thing you can do is set the wrong target. And then you might have great sales reps that are doing really well, but they're not winning. And then it becomes, it's not even about executing in the trenches anymore. It's about how the executive team doesn't know how to do planning and are a bunch of idiots. So ultimately, you've got to have that balance between, putting a goal together that makes economic sense, especially as you scale, whereas also is going to create that feeling of winning that we know is super important in a startup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like, that's a great rule of thumb, the 4 to 6x on target earnings. And I usually look at as a CFO, right? If the sales process is going to work and we have some return on investment here, usually not going under 3x, the OTE, to make sure, we have some return on what we're investing in sales. And then Ray, what do you think about, because this comes up a lot, I get the question a lot, with quotas is like, hey, what should the quota be? And it's a big open-ended question, but how do you think deal size affects, the quota size?
Yeah, it matters a lot, right? And so what you'll usually see if you look at big software companies now, like Twilio or something like that, is that the more mature a business gets, the closer to 6x their quota typically is. If you go and you hire, big deal strategic reps that are on a 350K OTE, the economics of that hire is not going to work if they close $1 million in new business fully ramped, right? So, ultimately the larger the deal size, usually the higher the quota. And then the other thing I'll guide is just when you see these companies have been around for 8-10 years and have grown super fast, I guarantee you quotas initially were probably much closer to 4x OTE, but as they got more efficient, as they got more brand power, then it likely scaled up to 6x OTE. When I think about the journey at Marketo that I was on for many years, early on those quotas were, we actually operated very efficiently and had pretty heavy quotas, but didn't hire reps as quickly. And so ultimately those are the levers that you think about. If you want to have higher quotas, you can ultimately do that. You might not be able to hire reps as fast, but as long as the productivity makes sense, you can make it work. But most of the time, sales ends up being a capacity game in the high growth stage. And so you want to set targets so people are winning, but then you can hire quickly, and that doesn't affect attainment.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we move on to my next favorite bullet here, when we had discussed before, you had an analogy about the strike zone, about a big strike zone. And I really love that because it's kind of such a simple concept to understand. And you kind of alluded to it here, but let's call this the strike zone concept. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
All right, I got to think back on it. A lot of my analogies are like lightning in a bottle, where like you got to catch them once or I forget. But I think what I was talking about, Ben, was, early on, your strike zone for what the quota can be forgiving about it. Okay. Like put yourself in the shoes of a brand new, let's say enterprise rep, your first enterprise rep. Your company has never figured out how to sell enterprise software yet. They're taking a risk by joining you. So put them in position to be successful if they do the work they're supposed to do. That's early on. So your strike zone might be bigger. Once you grow, you have customers, you have use cases, your Salesforce.com, then that strike zone gets a little bit smaller because you've seen it happen so many times and you have so much data that you know, okay, I should be able to hire someone on a 350 OTE and I can get 1.5. And if you can't generate 1.5, then it's you, not my process, right? But when you're in a startup, you're still figuring out the process. And you might have someone that is amazing, but your process is just a startup process that they're not in a position to ultimately get all the way there. So that's what I think about the strike zone. Hopefully I hit that point for you, Ben, and what you inferred when we first spoke.
Yeah, you threw a strike there. So that was,
that was
perfect. So, we've talked about, all right, how do we allocate that bookings pie? We've talked about quotas and my next favorite subject in here is commissions, right? So again, it's like, hey, how do we set quota? Now it's like, boy, where do we go with commissions? And of course, this can be all over the place. Again, depends on your sales motion, the experience of your reps. And I always have kind of frameworks that I look at. But Ray, how are you thinking about, hey, we're in our startup, we're growing, how do we think about commissions and what makes it attractive for reps to actually close a deal and then the incentive that they earned on that deal?
Well, every business is different. And I think to the point that you mentioned, really this comes down to the mindset of the founders and the executive team. I've had the experience working for some organizations that were highly go-to-market centric as a culture. And then I've worked in organizations that might be more finance led. And so ultimately it's about, who you are as a business. But for me, I always prefer paying big money to reps that overachieve and then maybe paying less money to reps that don't do 60% of plan. So I'd rather pay an underperformer less and an overperformer a lot more, because especially early on, overperformance is what's going to drive these big valuations and, that early growth that you're ultimately looking for. So I do also think that the complexity of the product matters too. If you've got some product that's a widget that's very transactional, it's more of a pitch and close, your commission rates might be on the lower side. And if you're selling a product that really requires good solution selling, great discovery, you're driving that deal the whole way. If you, as the rep, got hit by a bus, the deal would probably fall apart. That's when you're also want to be leaning more towards the let's really pay for overperformance so that we can get the best sales reps out there. Because sales reps talk. And at the end of the day, if you become known as a place that doesn't like paying salespeople, you're not going to get great ones. But if you become known as a place where, you're celebrating writing big commission checks, you're going to get the best. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you, that's one thing that, our CRO, Bill Bench, did at Marketo really well with the CEO of Marketo, is that the CEO of Marketo would go out and be like, we finally wrote a $1 million, check to an enterprise rep in 2014. And he celebrated that, where some companies might be like, oh, I'm overpaying a salesperson. Every culture is different. But in my opinion, I think you want to get sales reps winning. That's really what creates magic in a startup.
And then I'm going to put you on the spot here so we can make it actionable to the founders in the audience, because maybe hey, all right, I'll pay commissions. And I think, kind of mid-market enterprise type sales motion. I'm going to comp my sales reps on, first year ARR and maybe kickers for multi-year contracts, but let's give them a range to work with here so they can go and start drafting their comp plans. What do you think about a range that's fair, where you said, hey, underperformers maybe down here, but if you really achieve, we'll pay you well.
Yeah. So I have a wrap on being too, forward with commission rates that we may want to talk to, but I won't go down that now. But here's what I would say is that on the low end, in terms of dollar for dollar commission, I think the lowest you'll see is like 4% on a dollar closed. And then when you get into like crazy accelerators, if you've got someone that's 250% of plan and you're rewarding additional points for overperformance, you might see 25%, maybe even 28% if you got someone 300% of plan and you want to pay for that overperformance. And so that's a big area. I totally know, but you asked, like, that's kind of the range that I would give. But, one piece of guidance, and this is just my opinion, so take it for what you want, is I do see some companies being very in your face with, here's the commission rate, like you will make 9% on every dollar. And I don't know if you have to do that. I say that because if you make it about the commission rate and that's how you recruit people, well, guess what? They're gonna become obsessed with that commission rate. And the problem is, in this world in SaaS and hiring sales reps, there's always going to be someone that's willing to pay a higher rate. So, maybe you're paying reps 9% and they get really excited and they're making good money, and a recruiter calls them and says, we pay you 14%. You don't want to create that mindset, right? So I actually like to build kind of calculators that I'll give to the reps, and all they have to do is plug in what they closed and they'll see what they're making. And then you can look under the curtains if you want, but like, I like to avoid being too like, hey, I give 8%, 10%, 12%, because someone's always going to have a higher number. It's kind of like selling on price. If you're selling a software product, like we're talking about price too early and it's $10,000. Well, if you make it about price, someone will probably offer the same thing for 6.
Yep. No, great point. I like to think of kind of averages on average what we're paying, which maybe pinpoints the rate, but I like that scale. I like that approach. Yep. So next, let's touch briefly upon, usually, when I'm working with sales leaders, it's like, hey, we've got this quota, here's 100% quota, but then they have this attainment or achievement rate. And I always thought this was just kind of like a swag, it's like, hey, our quota is 500, but, let's just go for 80% of that. But you kind of frame this up, like life happens, things happen, reps leave, so how do you think about this attainment rate, or why are we using attainment when we've said, hey, our quota, is X dollars?
Yeah. So I think what you're referring to is, when you're building an operating plan for go-to-market, you've got this top line number that's essentially quota on the street. So we're in the month of May. So let's say you've got 5 reps. Their quotas are $100,000 a month, and so you've got $500,000 of quota on the street. I think Ben's saying, well, why can't that be the number? You've got the quota, so just take the number. And, that's when, a revenue leader or CFO will ultimately align. And so, I typically see what they call kind of like a sales productivity percentage. So, you might have 100% of your quota on the street, but there's a million things happening in the business that you want to build a little bit of buffer on. So the number that I usually see is like whatever your quota on the street is, take a 20% discount on that, and then that 80% productivity number off quota on the street becomes your kind of operating model, your board plan, whatever it might be. And the reason that makes sense to do is that stuff happens in a business that might not be the revenue leader's fault, but it's their problem. Right? Maybe a product launch that's supposed to come out in March gets delayed. Well, guess what? I doubt you're going to lower my quota on that. You're going to say, Ray, okay, it's coming out in 90 days. Figure it out. What if, 2 of my reps end up going on maternity or paternity, and I decide that, we're going to cover that across the team, right? Well, it's not my fault, but it's my problem, and you're probably not going to give me a quota reduction for that. So I think you've got to build in some kind of buffer. And then you ultimately use that sales productivity percentage number and you work to drive it up to become even more efficient. It also covers you if you're looking to hire, 5 more reps, if you're going to double the team, whatever it might be. As you double the team, it's unlikely that your sales productivity will rise with that. It takes time to ultimately incorporate new reps, to train them. So I've usually found it's a pretty reasonable trade-off with the finance team, as long as you're thinking about it on both sides. But sometimes, to your point, you've got to be able to frame your opinions like this with finance in a way that they can understand, because they're just trying to do their job too, which is to, take the resources that the company has and build a plan to execute in the best possible way.
Yeah, absolutely right. And that's why the finance team, if you have a CFO, they're usually heavily involved. Just understand, hey, the logic, how is sales approaching this? How are they building it up? And then what resource do you need? Is it people, is it training, whatever it is, to reach that plan, so finance a key component in helping, sales reach their goals. And as we kind of wind down this session, one thing, I also love to talk about and, seeing board slides, seeing forecasts is pipeline, right? And even if you're not, tracking pipeline officially in a CRM and have a formal process there, I think it's still good to touch upon this topic of pipeline, because we have our target. And usually, as a CFO, then I want to look at, does the pipe, if we're setting this target for next year, what does our current pipeline look like, and does it support it? So Ray, what are your thoughts there when we've got our targets, and then, looking at pipeline and pipeline management?
Yeah, the two main inputs to, winning and executing on a plan are going to come down to pipeline and capacity, right? So when you think about pipeline, you want to think about what your win rate is and what your conversion rate of that pipeline is. So let's just pick a round number. Let's say your win rate is 25%, which depending on your industry might be good, might be bad, but let's just go with that number. So let's say your win rate's 25% and your average sales cycle is 90 days long. So it's 3 months. Essentially what that means is that you need to have 4x of pipeline on what your quota is on the street or your sales productivity number to ultimately hit that goal. So if you got a 90-day sales cycle, you got June, July, August, your pipeline number in September, you would need to ensure that you've got that resourced to do $2 million in pipeline, so that you can ultimately hit that particular target. Mm-hmm. So you're just backing it in based on the 90 days. That's how you're going to want to think about it. So the key things you need as you're building and you're trying to figure out, do I have enough pipeline, are going to be the length of the sales cycle and the average sales price. That's going to be key. There's a lot of other things you can grab, but high level, you got to have those two things to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I've seen that rule of thumb used a lot, especially say mid-market enterprise, like, hey, my pipeline should be 3x what I'm trying to commit to, but of course I would love 4x, more buffer, the better in that pipeline to eventually flow down to new deals won. And in about, we've got maybe a minute left here. So, just one last question that just comes up a lot, especially early on, is the roles that you're hiring, because sometimes you don't have the budget to say, I'm going to have this dedicated sales role going after new business, this one after expansion, customer success, all that stuff. So how do you think about those early hires? Are we hiring hunters? Are we hiring farmers? What should we do in that kind of early hiring process?
Yeah, usually, so there's customer success, and some companies might hire customer success as like employee 4 or 5 if they have some early customers, but that job is not meant to be revenue driving.
Yep.
Early stage startups are going to err on the side of hunters for the most part, because if they're hiring a bunch of farmers as their first reps, then I think venture capitalists and people that are given the money are going to ask themselves, like, why are you already investing in farmers? Does that mean you got a market problem and you can't add more new customers? So I would wager that your first 2 reps are likely to be in the hunter type mentality, unless you've got like a product-led growth business where they're more guides. But if you don't, it's probably more of the hunter, to the point you made.
Great. Yeah, great point. Yeah, going after the new business, aligning that with hunters who are going to close those new logos for you versus the farmers, right? Who farmers were saying going after expansion business within your existing customer base. So I think, well, that was great, man. We really packed a lot in there. Ray, appreciate it. And if we have time, we'll open it up to Q&A here. So really enjoyed it, Ray.
Cool. Thanks.